So we're ready for our third installment, which is Zionism 101. Before we begin though, want to tell you that our olive oil came in from My Tree Israel. We're doing a fundraiser with My Tree Israel, where we're adopting olive trees in Israel to help the farmers there. And we get oil in return. So we're very excited about it. Sarah Levine can go down with you after this lecture to go pick it up if you've got olive oil waiting for you. If you go right ahead. Oh, you mean like next week? Okay, so next week at services, by all means.
So next week at services, if you have not ordered olive oil, Yishai and Kobe from My Tree Israel are actually going to be here with us for services. And they are going to be providing some olive oil for tasting and some of their new venture, which is wine, which will be in time for Passover. So please come join us Friday night for services and come taste some of it. And of course, we will be adopting trees and getting olive oil for next December as well.
Okay, so without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome back Professor Gil Troy for our third installment on Zionism. And we chomping at the bit to hear from you again. I think if you had just spoken straight until 12:30, a lot of people have been very happy with that. So it's a pleasure to welcome you back to our social hall for your next installment. Everybody, Gil Troy.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom and happy deli. No better way to celebrate Shabbat than with some good New York deli, New Jersey deli in this case. In the spirit of Shabbat and of continuing the Dvar Torah that I started this morning, I mentioned the two climactic moments. I talked about the power of the struggle between Jacob and Angel, the powerful force. And I skipped over this climactic confrontation between Jacob and his brother. And in the text, we see the notion of faces. What face do we show to one another? What kind of face does Esau have for Jacob, and what kind of face does Jacob have for Esau? And there's also a notion of panim el panim, of the confrontation between Jacob and God. Him, her, itself, I'm not going to go there. Well, that's the theology class. And I think when we talk about Zionism, and I think when we talk about Israel, and we talk about a relationship with this place 6,000 miles away. And we were just talking about this amazing trip you're planning and how you're going to have two buses, one for those who are first timers and those who are there who have for second and third timers. Each one of us comes with our Israel story. Each one of us comes with our Israel baggage. Each one of us comes with our Israel expectations. And so too, we're actually on the trip. So too, when we pick up the phone these days, the holy, all-powerful phone, and look at the news, we watch it on television, when we hear about Israel, we come with expectations. And I think one of the things I'm trying to invite us to do is think through what those expectations are, what those assumptions are. And on the one hand, drill down to foundations. So last night I talked about this vision of identity Zionism. And this morning I talked about Reform Zionism, which is really kind of American Zionism. And today I want us to look more closely at Israel itself, at the 75-year-old experiment in creating a Jewish democracy. And also ask the question, what are some of the assumptions that we bring to the table? What are some of the ways we ourselves may be distorting the conversation? And what are the things we need to learn about how to learn? And I mentioned it briefly last night, but it starts with my biggest frustration, which is what I call the 48, 56, 67, 73 hike approach to Israeli history. Right and left do the same thing. We tell the history of Israel through the wars: 1948, War of Independence; 1956, the Sinai Campaign; 1967, the Six-Day War; 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Now, first of all, by the way, it's really interesting. Since the 1973 war, which is a long time ago, Israel has not really faced a conventional war. And the 1973 war is a fascinating story for a historian. Because you know that moment in history in America in 1941 called Pearl Harbor? What happened? It was a dastardly surprise attack on America. But when we talk about World War II, we talk about us as having been victorious. We won World War II. We helped save the world, despite the ugly, painful, deadly beginning. What's really interesting about the Yom Kippur War is that we, and when I say we, I mean the Jewish people as well as Israel, as well as democracies all over the world, won that war. But the cost of 2,700 young lives on the Israeli side and 10,000 Arab lives was so heavy. The trauma of 1973 was so great that we don't really celebrate it. And in fact, every Yom Kippur in Israel, the newspapers are filled with more revelations about how the conception, missed the signs that something was happening. And I'm mentioning the conception because, again, one of the things I want to talk to us today about is our conception, our conceptions, what we might be missing by some of the assumptions which we bring to the table. And so we've buried the lead, which is that since 1973, the Arab armies have not massed to attack. Since 1973, there's been an understanding, there's been an acceptance in some ways of Israel's place in the Middle East. And who knew it during those terrifying days of October and November 1973? But since then, we've been able to count this thing called a peace process. Egypt, Jordan, the Oslo attempt, the Abraham Accords. And so it really is a pivot in Israeli history and another reminder to sort of free ourselves from all the war talk. It's May 14th, 1948. I spoke last night about the excitement in the Jewish world on November 29th, 1947. How no one had to be told, go out and sing and dance. And the same thing, May 14th, 1948. My father-in-law, to be, at the time he wasn't my father-in-law, Marcel Adams was a Romanian immigrant who had been in the youth movements in Romania, and somehow in 1944 was able to get safe passage out of Romania to Palestine. And he used to like to say in his heavy Romanian accent, I'm Palestinian, because he had a Palestinian passport, reminding us that identities shift. And he missed the boat. He missed the boat called the Struma, which blew up. And he was on the next boat, the Maritza. And he came to Palestine in 1944 and was a Halutz, and he happened to be in Tel Aviv, May 14th, 1948. And we were smart enough when he was 90 years old and still quite sharp to record his life story. He passed a year and a half ago at the age of 100. And he tells the excitement of being there. David Ben-Gurion, that beautiful, bald man, reads the Declaration of Independence, and then an important symbol that we forget, Rabbi Yehuda Lev Maimon, who had flown in on a single passenger jet from Jerusalem, aircraft from Jerusalem, because Ben-Gurion thought it was really important to make sure there was at least one rabbi there, one representative of religious Zionism there, says the Shechianu, the prayer, and then everybody starts dancing, and when Marcel, my father-in-law, was reporting it, and he of course always had a jacket and tie, of that generation, he says, look at me, I'm alive, I'm here. Hitler missed. The anti-Zionists missed. The haters missed. And look what we created. And so, when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel, I hope we're celebrating that, what I talked about last night, from the leap of faith to the leap of hope. I hope that we're able to see Israel in context. And so what I wanted to do today is, let's think about the timeline. I want us to think about what I often have to do, which is I'm invited to speak to Birthright participants. I was invited last week to speak to a delegation from the New York City Council. How do I explain Israel? How do I tell the story in a few quick images and yet stay true to the truth and true to what I talked about last night, which is the complexity of the story as well as the power and the romance of the story. And we have to go to that great cheesy romance from the 1970s and start singing. Where do I begin? Right? Because we know as historians, where you begin the story often determines where you end up. Right? We know when we have an argument, and depending on where we're going to tell the story, that's in some ways setting us up for the conclusion. So similarly, it's really important for me in an age where, as I said this morning, even professors of Jewish studies and professors of Israel studies are trying to rob us of our past, rob us of our legitimacy, rob us of our roots, and call us settler colonialists, which is just the wrong word, an inaccurate, sloppy, hijacking. When the British come to the Northeast from afar with no ties here, that is colonialism. When they go to India, that is colonialism. When you're returning to your land, even if you're in conflict with some of the inhabitants, and they themselves have their own journey of being nomads, they themselves have their own journey of coming in the 1920s and 1930s because there was a boom thanks to the British. They have their own complexities. It's not a colonial story. It doesn't fit the paradigm. Why shove it in? And so I go back to Lech Lecha. I go back to 3,500 years ago with Abraham and Sarah and talk about how central Israel has always been, the land of Israel, to the people of Israel. The people who were renamed in this moment that we read in the Parsha of the struggle, of the challenge. And we talk about Exodus, and we talk about David and Solomon, and the first temple being destroyed, and the second temple being destroyed, and that word exile. What's the power of the word exile? What does it say to us? Wherever your grandparents or great-grandparents were, wherever anybody was throughout the years of Jewish wander, in Morocco, in Russia, in Poland, in Romania, when they stood up and prayed, they turned to Zion. No matter how at home they might have felt, especially after the Enlightenment and Emancipation we were talking about this morning, no matter how normal they might have felt, at the moment that they turned to pray, they knew they were in exile. So we had a deed to the land that we never gave up. And we also had continuous ties to the land. The four holy cities of Jerusalem and Hebron, and Tiberias and Tzfat, always had Jews there. Anybody ever sing Lecha Dodi? Anybody was here last night sang Lecha Dodi, right? That is a beautiful hymn welcoming the Sabbath in the hills of the Galilee by a resurgence, a spiritual and materialist resurgence that occurs in Tzfat in the 15 and 1600s. That's just one little example of how, again, intertwined the story is. And so when I tell the history of Zionism, notice it's not number one, it's not number two, it's not number three, it's not number four, it's not number five, it's not number six, it's number 7 on the list of the timetable. Because that moment in 1897, when Theodor Herzl says, we are a people, and I'm going to launch the Zionist Congress, it's not a moment from nowhere. It's a moment that's been building up in Jewish history, in a natural rhythm of Jewish history. And then I add the 1921 and 1947 partitions. 1921 is a partition that actually worked, where the mandate was established. And by the way, if I say something that's unclear, stop me. But in 1921, when the British take over, they hive off what they call Transjordan, today modern Jordan, which originally was part of the broader area of Palestine. And as I already alluded to, The British census from the 1930s, and of course the British are very proper and organized, shows that there's a resurgence of population in Jerusalem, in the whole area of Palestine, not just because of German Jews who are coming as things start becoming wonky even in the 1920s, from the inflation before even Hitler. Not just from the Jews who are coming from Russia and Poland, but from Arabs who are coming from as far as Libya, present-day Libya, and Syria, and elsewhere, because there's an economic movement, there's an economic stability thanks to the British. I say this to emphasize that anybody, Jewish, non-Jewish, left, right, who talks to me about the borders of Israel or Palestine is either a fool or a fanatic. The borders changed at least 6 times in the 20th century alone. The borders, are you talking about David's kingdom or Solomon's kingdom? Are you talking about promises made in the Bible? And the Bible is a book of leadership and values. It's not a real estate name. Where is it from? And once we can get off of that, once we can actually see the flow, once we can actually see the complexity, once we can actually see outside forces coming in and cutting us up, knocking us down, building us up, we can get to compromise. I like the fact that in English, complexity and compromise overlap at the beginning. They don't rhyme, but they, right? Once I understand complexity, once I understand that things may not be so cut and dry, then I'm less of a fanatic because I'm in the world of mixing and the world of balancing and the world of juggling, and I can find some pathway through. That's what's all too often missing in the conversation. That's why I do this exercise. In 1947, even though I keep on emphasizing that for me, the important thing was the affirmation of Jewish statehood, the affirmation of the Zionist idea. If your brain is stuck, what do I do? I look at this map that the Peel Commission proposed in 1937, and it's like a piece of Swiss cheese. That's not defensible. I need clear borders. And look at our heart and soul being in Jerusalem. And the UN wants to internationalize it? Is this a plan? But sounding like you just come out of the kitchen, he literally says, half a loaf is better than none. We just lost 6 million Jews in the Shoah. If we can avoid war, let's avoid war. Let's accept this painful, painful compromise. But he's cautious. He knows that if he looks too enthusiastic about the compromise, the Arabs negotiating the other side will lose enthusiasm. So he keeps his distance, he keeps his unhappiness, and the UN pushes it through. And as I said last night, both the US and the UN, the US and the Soviet Union vote for it. And it is the Arab leadership, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, the Arab leadership which rejects it. There's a very important book called Palestine Betrayed by Ephraim Karsh. And he says, who betrayed the Palestinians? The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the extremists. There were moderate Palestinian Arabs, right? Because we know my father-in-law was also Palestinian. I set that up. We know that there were moderate Palestinian Arabs who worked with the Jews, who were happy to live with the Jews, who saw their lives improving thanks to the Jews coming back, who wanted to compromise. And those of us who have seen the movie Exodus know what happens to the moderate. And that's just a fictional representation, a cinematic representation of what really happened. The extremists won. The extremists hijacked the Palestinian story. And so, in May 1948, as the Union Jack is lowered, the battle flag has to be raised. 6,000 of the 600,000 Jews living in Palestine and now the new state of Israel at the time end up dying. And so I understand the power of the war story. I understand the power of the war trauma. I understand why we go to 48, 56, 67, 73 hike. What I tried to do here is bring in, from my experience as an American historian, where I love to teach about the decades. And so I've written books about Ronald Reagan and the 1980s. and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Right, and CNN does a very successful series in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, because we think in decades. So what I thought was we should recreate our history of Israel, retell the story of Israel, not just through the wars, not just through the conflict, not just through the headlines, not just through the drama, but through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And that's why I've shared this sheet with you. And so what's the story really of the 1950s? David Ben-Gurion is told, don't accept too many Jews from all over. We can't afford it. He says, he's told by his treasury secretary, we can't afford to accept them. And he said, we cannot afford not to accept them. And we definitely have our criticisms of David Ben-Gurion not respecting the Mizrahi culture enough. But he understood the importance of letting every single Jew in and welcoming them and giving them citizenship. And I'm going to criticize my Palestinian brothers and sisters who call first and second and third and fourth generation Palestinians refugees. We call them citizens, we call them brothers, we call them sisters. We accepted them. And 850,000 Jews ultimately came from the Arab and Muslim countries. Think about how hard it was to absorb them. In a given month in 48, 49, when Israel first started, food was rationed. Not because of the heavy-handed socialist regime, but because there was no food. Ben-Gurion sends a telegram to the Washington embassy saying, by February, we're running out of bread. Cleansing breath. Think of all the bounty we have in our lives. Think of all we've eaten in the last 12 hours since I arrived in this wonderful, welcoming community. Think of that big, heavy deli sandwich I just had. In 1948, the rations were 12 eggs per adult per month, 11 slices of cheese, 7 ounces per adult per month, 1.6 ounces of 1.6 pounds of meat, which is like 8 small hamburgers and 1 typical hamburger we eat these days per month. Think about that. And nevertheless, we accept. Israel's population doubles from 1948 to 1950, from 600,000 to 1.2 million. Now, here's, of course, the great irony of history. The Arabs in Syria, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, by kicking out the Jews, saved the Jews of Israel and gave us the population boost that we needed. And when we talk about the 1960s, we talk about the era of the kibbutz and Israel being so popular and Moshe Dayan with his dashing eye patch and an understanding that, wow, there's a kind of communal experiment. Israel was the one experiment that was working post-World War II. And then the 6-Day War, and George Will has a great line. I'm not sure he's ever been quoted in one, so I'll have him quote Mr. Joker. He said, Israel did a terrible thing in the 1960s. Israel won. Israel won at a point when the world was deciding they were in love with underdogs. And the world has always been much happier with the Jew as victim. And all of a sudden, rather than looking at us as David, we became Goliath. But notice the quotation that I have here. In 1967, at the height of the start of the war, when bombs were already falling on Jerusalem, and civilians are being killed in Jerusalem, Levi Eshkol, the prime minister, sent a message to General Odd Bull, a name you can't forget, the Norwegian chief of staff, saying, we won't initiate any action against Jordan. But Jordan initiated action against Israel, and that's how Israel ended up with Jerusalem and the territories. And we talked about how illuminating, how exciting, how inspiring that was for so many Jews. And then, of course, I wanted to give the upside of 73 at the beginning, but we know the trauma of 73 and the arrogance that led to the conceptia, that led to blind spots, not reading the intelligence properly, and the loss of too many lives. And even though Israel won, Israel lost some of its mojo, lost some of its confidence. But what happened on July 4th, 1976? Well, we were celebrating the bicentennial here. And I remember, I can't tell you who to, July 1st, plane had been hijacked. July 2nd, we heard about this selection how the non-Jews were freed and the Jews were forced to stay behind for the terrorists, and how the captain and his crew said, this has happened before, but we're not abandoning you. And then on July 4th, crossing Africa, Israel goes and frees hostages. Israelis, but also Jews and human beings saying, we will not accept terrorism. And that gives a certain kind of resurgence of pride and a certain joy that had been missing since Yom Kippur. And the 1980s should have been a high because 1979 had this amazing breakthrough with the signing of the Camp David Accords. First peace with Egypt. But you have tremendous inflation. I'm sure none of you know what inflation is like and what it does to your morale. But this inflation was inflation on steroids. 14%, not per month, but not per year, but per month. And a real loss of faith and a fear. Oh my goodness, where are we going to go? How are we going to survive? And the 1990s, well, there's this experiment in peace called the Oslo Accords, which by the 2000s hasn't really survived much. Although the main infrastructures in the Middle East today are still by the Oslo Accords. What's going on in the Israeli economy? A shift from a very heavy-handed, very protexia-driven, very socialist economy to the high-tech boom. And most exciting in the last 20 years beyond Israel's emergence as a startup nation are two things that I want to emphasize. One, its continuing role as a values nation. Its continuing attempt to balance a high-tech, modern, capitalist economy with values and a values conversation, a conversation about who we are. I call this the Great Israel Disconnect. What I read about in the papers about Israel and what I experience on the street is very different. Israel and the United States are in competition for who has the highest percentage of its economy devoted to NGOs and civil society. 9.2, 9.5, 9.7% goes back and forth. I'm really proud of that competition. We all knew what happened in Surfside and the buildings collapsed. Why would you think that the small country in the Middle East might be able to help? And you know the story? They send a delegation and they come, and the first thing they do, everybody's digging in the rubble. And what is the Israeli delegation? These well-dressed superstar soldiers. They start having coffee with all the survivors and all the relatives of the victims. They might go, what's going on? We got to dig. We're having coffee. Why are they having coffee? They're sitting and talking to each one of the people who knew the people who disappeared most intimately. And at the end of the coffee, they pull out the blueprints and they say, so tell me, given an average evening at that time of night, where would your mother, friend, brother, loved one be? In the living room? In bed? Television? Working like Professor Troy, like a madman at night? Once they've done the intelligence, then they said, oh, look, dig there, they find a wedding ring. Dig there, they find some bones. And the Americans go, what was going on? They said, we just wanted to do, we wanted to reconnoiter. So here you have not brawn, but brain. And I'm sure you saw that beautiful video when they left Florida. How everybody just sort of stood at attention and gave them honor and said, thank you for coming. That's Tikkun Olam, my friends. And that's going for what I was talking earlier about particularism to universalism. Because we have an army, because we have agency, because we have our own story, because we have our own power, we could do that for the world. And so, before I open to questions, I want to summarize what I call Zionism's 7 miraculous Israeli achievements. 1, reestablishing Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish homeland. Think about how homeless, how lost, how alienated we were from ourselves and from history. 2, integrating not just the 850,000, but 3 million Jews from all over the world, including Ethiopians, Russians, the broken Jews of the world coming and being welcomed in Israel. And also being the first country to welcome the Vietnamese boat people, thanks to Menachem Begin in the 1970s. 3, returning the Jews to history transforming the Jews from the world's victims to fellow actors on a global stage. Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, has a great line. He said, quoting Delmore Schwartz, the hip poet, he said, "In dreams begin responsibilities." And Zionism is about taking responsibility. 4, building a hybrid Western-style capitalist democracy with a Jewish flavor. This mix of startup nation and values nation. This mix, as I talked about this morning, of spirit and power, of body and soul. This mix that you feel in Israel, trying to figure out, how do we create a moral country? How do we create a country of good? How do we create a gorgeous mosaic? 5th, the social cultural Altneuland. The culture that's going on in Israel, the food, the wine. Anybody old enough to remember visiting Israel in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when the wine was Carmel, sweet, poopy, syrupy wine? And the food was a big debate. Do you have falafel first or hummus first? Or do you have hummus first? And I thought, it was, hummus falafel. My father was there in the 1950s. Then you had eggplant for breakfast, eggplant for lunch, and eggplant leftovers for dinner. In my family, we never had eggplant. Those were the days of Tzena. And look now, food, the culture. 6, the resurrecting a Hebrew language as a living language. Much as I love deli, my favorite food as a Queen's boy is pigs in blankets. What do we call that in Hebrew? Moshe beteva, Moses in a basket. Is that cute or what? More traumatic to my kids was when we got to Israel and my little daughter loved cotton candy. What is cotton candy called in formal Hebrew? Se'arot savta, grandma's hair. But think about that cultural creativity. Think about what's going on. How do we take this dead language and bring it alive? It's holy language, paper language, person too. And David Ben-Gurion, when he's involved in the fight over reparations, he says, I don't like that word reparations. And we're not taking a penny of German money for all the bodies that were destroyed, all the souls that were destroyed. But we will take some money for property, the property that was stolen. And so in Hebrew, reparations the word is shilumim, payments. Very interesting. So we not only see how language can be used to resurrect, but also language can speak a different kind of language. He was trying to make certain boundaries. And of course, Menachem Begin thought you shouldn't take any money at all. Those 6 highlights are 6 accomplishments within Israel. The 7th is us, right here, creating a strong, proud Jewish diaspora, creating a diaspora which won't be pushed around like Jews were during the Holocaust when they were afraid to speak up to Franklin Roosevelt. A culture of Jews who are more comfortable with their bodies, more comfortable with themselves. And that's the power of the Zionist revolution. And so in April, when we celebrate the 75th anniversary, let's celebrate it with what I call Zionist salons, sitting around and reading texts of the great Jewish thinkers about Zionism. What does Israel mean? What can it mean? What does it mean? And what will it mean tomorrow? I want us to have bicentennial moments. Do you remember in 1976 when America was in such a down? And every night at 7:59 p.m. before the holy start of prime time on CBS, they'd have a minute telling a little bit of American history. We need 75 minutes celebrating Zionist heroes, celebrating Israeli moments, celebrating some of the things I'm talking about today. I don't know if in New Jersey there was a COVID lockdown like we had in Israel, but remember that first Pesach when we couldn't sit around with one another? But there was Saturday night Seder, and people in the creative community spent 2 weeks and put together and say, now immediately it was a little cheesy, I don't know if I needed George from Seinfeld, Jason Alexander's going, okay. It was an attempt. We need a Saturday night Seder celebrating the 75th anniversary, and we have more time. And as I mentioned yesterday, I want every young Jewish kid to wake up with ice cream for breakfast. I want us to remember how unique and special and sweet, for all its challenges, Israel still is. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Where do you see things going now? Netanyahu elected, I mean, I won't regret that extreme part of this happened. We'll just throw out the Arabs living in Israel. Where do you see things going?
You know, I always say, as a historian, it's hard enough for me to predict the past. I can't begin to predict the future. And it's very interesting to me, even from a tactical perspective. I think many of the attacks that are going on now against the Netanyahu cabinet are a mistake, not because I agree with anything that's being done, but I want things to happen before the attack starts. Because I'm afraid that we're inuring the Israeli population to some of the problems that they might face. With people saying, "Oh, I'm watching my Israel is no more democracy." Israel, first of all, is a split democracy that has voted 5 times, and as I said the other night, a shift of 4,000 or 5,000 votes. And by the way, the voting rates in Israel this election were 76%, and in the previous elections were 67%. It's quite remarkable. The voting rates in Tel Aviv are about 60%. So if more people voted in Tel Aviv, who tend to be more from the left side of the spectrum, we have a very different conversation going on. And I say this, I don't like being partisan in a synagogue, but I'll put on the table, because it's in my Jerusalem Post columns, I have criticized Itamar Ben-Gvir every which way. And I have very difficult, and I'm unhappy with his rise. But first of all, he's been very careful to say he wants to throw out terrorists, not Arabs. He's changed his rhetoric. And I just don't know if I buy it, but I just want to point that out. And the biggest question, we were talking about this before, I just don't know which BB is going to show up to work. That's the big question. And part of the buildup, and the more Avi Maoz makes his ridiculous demands, and and Ben-Gvir makes his ridiculous demands, the more BB's ego is going to be bruised potentially, and he may want to show that he's protecting democracy. He gave this very interesting interview to Barry Weiss and his Substack, and I called it BB the Magnificent. He was being pro-democracy, and he was saying, "I'm in charge," and he was saying, "We're not going to go back." Now, I'll also say something else. I'm more worried about Ben-Gvir than Avi Maoz. Why? First of all, Ben-Gvir has 7 votes in cabinet seats. Avi Maoz has a sub-cabinet position. Secondly, the shift in terms of the acceptance of LGBTQ rights in Israel has gone so deep that no cabinet minister, certainly no sub-cabinet minister, is going to stop it. Ben-Gvir scares me more because of Bibi's own democratic manipulations, demagogic manipulations, I should say, he's brought out these demons. And so I look at Ben-Gvir as much more of a threat, but to me it's a threat in terms of Israel's soul, less in terms of the actual policy. And I'll tell you one more thing which will help you sleep well at night. I want to challenge you. Name me one cabinet in either Israeli history or American history, one cabinet member who ever ruined the country's soul. I think we have a tendency, because we're unhappy with some of the choices, to exaggerate the power any of these people will have. And I looked at Time Magazine's list of the most influential cabinet members in American history. People like Elizabeth Dole, people like George Marshall, who tried to stop Harry Truman from recognizing the state of Israel, and yet 11 minutes after the state of Israel was created, it was recognized. So I think we have to put, even if we're unhappy with the choices, we have to wait for the crimes to occur. It's like Minority Report, Steven Spielberg's Tom Cruise thriller, where we're worried about pre-crimes. I'm waiting for what's really going to happen. I'm waiting to see who shows up. And I'm also understanding that cabinet members talk a lot, especially in Israel, and rarely make a difference. The other thing, if you want to calm down, read Robert Reich's memoir called, anybody know that remarkable memoir? It's called Locked in the Cabinet. Robert Reich, super smart guy, Harvard, Berkeley, good friends of Bill Clinton, comes in to be Secretary of Labor, and he realizes just how little power he has from day to day. So that makes me sleep well at night. Yes, Sarah, you're gonna. No.
I forgot.
Okay, I've got my answer, so we're good.
One of the ways you can judge an idea is how many imitators you have. Who's imitating Zionists?
Oh, very interesting question. So, first of all, as someone who's worked voluntarily with Birthright for 20 years, it's really interesting to me how many different communities have approached us. Koreans, Irish Americans, trying to, hey, wait a minute, you're doing something really interesting with your next generation. And we're worried about next generation. So in terms of what I was talking about last night is identity Zionism, I see a lot of imitators. And I know in Berlin, we spend a lot of time working with them and saying, let's partnership, because there's a question of how do you in America, which as I've said before, breaks down so many identities, how we build up identities. That's one imitator. Second imitator is that when we look at the most successful countries in the world, there was a while where everybody was really excited about what was going on in Southeast Asia with countries like Singapore. I'm not so enamored with their civil rights approach, but there's a certain functionality. When we see the growing relationship between Israel and India, and I know people like to emphasize the two strongmen in charge, but there's actually an understanding of the power of old new. There's a connection between Israel and Japan and Israel and India and Israel and China, what it is to build a modern civilization on an ancient civilization. But most important to me is I need more of a back and forth and more of a partnership between Israel and the United States of America on this issue, which is that I think Israel is offering a really interesting model of liberal nationalism. I think Israel's offering an interesting model of this, what I call leap of hope. And Theodore Herzl himself looked to America as a model. And I think that at a moment when so many in the United States, so much especially in blue America, have lost faith in nationalism, have lost faith in a values-based nationalism, have lost faith in a nationalism which can make the world better. I think it may be helpful to look to Israel as a model. Yes.
Yeah, he spoke extensively about the Jews' historical claim to the land of Israel timeline. What is the basis for the Palestinians' claim to the land? When did they show up, and why do they think they have the historical claims to land?
Thank you for that. So here's where it gets very touchy, because I, as someone who has been really annoyed by Palestinians getting up and saying, well, Judaism is just a religion, and you guys don't have any ties to the land. I'm extremely careful not to sit in judgment on Palestinian ties, because part of it is, and I'm a historian, but part of it is simply, if you have two peoples in love with the same land, whatever the historical background, we have to deal with it, especially in the modern world. So I preface my whole answer, because you're asking a technical historical question, by going into the politics of it and saying, I'm very, very respectful of the Palestinian claim. I'd rather acknowledge the complexity and acknowledge that I have no doubt that if Palestinians could click their heels 3 times and make the Jews go away, they would do that. And I have no doubt that even many of the most liberal Jews, they could make their heels 3 times and have the Palestinians all move to Syria. That would solve the problem, right? But we're stuck with one another. So at a certain level, Henry Ford, another person who probably hasn't been quoted in the temple, was right? History is bunk, right? That history doesn't help solve the problem when you have 800,000 people who say, wait a minute, I'm here in one of the entities. And how you count Palestinians is also very complicated. Nevertheless, okay, really bad politically incorrect joke. Goes back to the 20 years ago during the Oslo, during the Camp David Accords. And Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat are about to sit in the second Abraham Accords. And Ehud Barak says, Mr. Clinton, Mr. President, before we start, we're reading in the Bible this week how the Palestinians came and stole our land and terrorized us and brutalized us and how horrible they are. And Yasser Arafat says, Mr. President, we weren't even there then. And Ehud Barak said, absolutely, now we can begin. So terrible, evil, but there's a certain truth to that, right? So yes, if you play the historical game, there's a big question of who are the Palestinians, right? But ultimately, we know that Islam starts with Muhammad in the 8th century, thousands of years after Judaism starts, but it sees itself as the successor religion. We know that when you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Mosque of Omar or the Dome of the Rock, part of the reason it's not on theirs is partially because sociologically and anthropologically, as Muslims would conquer, they would find the holy places and try to make them their own. But there also was kind of an attempt to say, hey, wait a minute, we are the successor religion. So some Palestinians say, oh, well, actually, we come from the Plishtim, from the Philistines. But to me, again, the origins are murky. They're certainly after us. So all I want to emphasize is us. All I want to emphasize is that we have legitimate claims there. I want to emphasize the fact that the West Bank is not organic. The West Bank is an artificial creation that was improvised in the armistice agreement. Even if that becomes the basis for negotiation, at least acknowledge it. That's what I was saying yesterday also about the analogy with the paper and the handkerchief. At least acknowledge our claims. So I don't want to do what they do and try to rob them of their claims. I want to say we've got issues, and history only helps us a little bit, but at least gives us legitimacy. But the real challenge is going forward. And by the way, I was at APAC convention back when there was one at the height of the Barack Obama, John Kerry initiatives. And we were having a session and I said, I don't want Barack Obama running the peace train. And I don't want John Kerry running the peace train. I want us running the peace train. I don't want to be the Zionist idea of in dreams begin responsibilities, right? Of taking responsibility, returning to history is we're a startup nation, we're a pharma nation, we're so creative. We should be the ones to create the new vision. And by the way, that's why so many of us are excited about the Abraham Accords, because with the Abraham Accords, it was an attempt to say, okay, the failure of Oslo was top down. This is an attempt to make it bottom up. This is an attempt to what I call go from peace now to peace more. The more peace we have, the better off we are. So that's also, and the other thing I try to do is I want to add an S to the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Because if it's the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's never changing. And my whole analysis that as 1973 Arab armies have been attacked is irrelevant. If it's at the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's never getting better. There's been no movement. But if it's the Arab-Israeli conflict, and we say, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, peace with Morocco, peace with the UAE, peace, 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 peace. Maybe we can create a circle of goodness, a circle of love that reduces the conflict. Time for one last question.
So, following up on the last question, you had talked about a time when the British were around and both Jews and Arabs moved in, started settlements of economic opportunity, and that when the state of Israel was created, the radicals, fundamentalists on the Muslim side sort of moved things. What do you envision would have happened if that didn't happen and Palestinians maybe didn't leave the land and settled in there while becoming a Jewish democracy? What would it look like today? And the reason I'm asking that is not because I want to play thought experiment and dream about something that never happened, but rather, can we look at that and then think about what might have happened then? Can we provide some clues as to how to undertake this ongoing negotiation and move the Arab-Israeli conflicts to get a new level?
At the time, Judah P. Magnus and Martin Buber led an initiative for a binational state. And not only did it fail on the international stage, but they never found any Arab, kept from Palestinian because they're Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs, never found any Arab partners on the other side. So there nowadays you find some scholars who fall in love with these peace plans of theirs, but they don't acknowledge the unhappy ending, which was, it was a one-way conversation. And it's true, the if of history is a complicated game. If the moderates had won instead of the militants, then it would be able to live side by side. If there hadn't been, what would that look like? So here's the thing, and here's where I get into trouble with many right-wing audiences. There already is a Palestinian state in many ways. Take the most aggressive right-wing Ben-Gvirist you can find. He or she is not allowed to pass those red and white signs that are dotted throughout Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, which say you're not allowed in. I quickly, because it's Shabbat afternoon, I want to liberate you soon, said that Oslo peace process is pretty much over, but I also added that the current relationships and the current status of Palestinians is basically based on Oslo. And when I used to drive my daughter to Beit El, which is mentioned in the Parsha this week, where she served, and I would pass Ramallah, and I'd pass those red and white signs saying, you're not allowed in. And then I'd pass and I'd see Palestinian flag flying over Ramallah. It made me happy. Do you know what made me happy? Because if they are able to fulfill their national aspirations there on one clear side of the border, and we're able to fulfill our national aspirations on the other side of the border, win-win. So I think the most important thing, and I think the high-tech world might be open to this, is I think we have to free ourselves from the fascism of geography. We grew up in a world where we think that only states this is like what I was saying about the Swiss cheese, that states have to be really clear, right? They have to be nicely, look how the British came in and the borders they drew, right, with maps and rulers. Human beings don't live by rulers. And maybe what we need to do is start thinking about archipelagos. Maybe we need to start thinking about centers and where we make sure that there's autonomy each side, that there's creativity, that there's prosperity, there's dignity, there's as much political autonomy as possible. And then the fact that next door is a Jewish neighbor who raises a blue and white flag, and next door there's a Palestinian neighbor who raises their flag, won't be a problem. Now, obviously, in order to get to that, you have to have a change in conception. But that's the way I try to think when I try to think creatively. And there are some thinkers on the Palestinian side. Sari Nusseibeh, the former president of a major university in Palestine, wrote a book that was published at Harvard University Press in English and wasn't translated into Arabic. And he asks, what's a state worth? And he says, I'm tired of burying Palestinian kids just for this notion of completeness. And maybe if we go city by city, or also, and I think we Westerners impose our assumptions, we forget that Palestinian society is also very much tribal based, very much Hamula based. And Hebron is very different than Jenin, is very different than Bethlehem. And so maybe we can create some kind of patchwork quilt of peace, rather than this monolithic approach to peace.
Including maybe Arab towns in Israel?
Yeah, although it's in Nusseibeh's book, he captures the complexity of modern Arab identity. And he talks about Ahmed Tibi, who was one of the most harsh critics of Zionism and of Israel, but serves in the Israeli Knesset and gets an Israeli pension. And he's being interviewed by Al Jazeera. And they say exactly that. They said, well, you're a big advocate of Palestinian state. Would you move there? And he goes, what are you talking about? I'm an Israeli. I love that. May we always lean into the complexity. May we always lean into the juggle. May we always lean into the complexity, because that's the first step to compromise and to peace. Shabbat shalom.
I hate saying this, but we only have one more talk left. Tomorrow morning, 10:30, Beit Midrash. We're going to gather there, and I can't wait to see where the last one goes. So thank you all.